Bill, Michael Shermer is the founding publisher of Skeptic Magazine. And yeah, I started seeing him on some of the top talk shows in the 80s. If any of you boomers remember Donahue, he was on there a lot, some of the other shows. Dr. Stephen Meyer is director of the Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture, and his newest book is The Return of the God Hypothesis. And Bill, I've noticed that there are a lot of people commenting that this debate, we're going to see this exchange, we're going to see some clips from it between these two, that it's an example of a very respectful civil exchange. They stick to their views, but they're generous with one another, and they have a good time. And Bill, you've had interactions with both of these gentlemen. I know they interact with your work all the time. What are your interactions with
Now, Steve
Michael?
Meyer is remarkably ironic. As a defender of intelligent design, he is passionately hated by many people, and he always handles himself with such aplomb and calmness and integrity. I think I first met Steve in 1994 at an intelligent design conference at Queen's College, Cambridge, which brought together Steve Meyer, Bill Dembski, Michael Behe, Paul Nelson, and Philip Johnson. They were all there, and it was just the beginning, just the naissance of the intelligent design movement. And I was privileged to participate in that. And then since then, over the years, Steve and I have joined forces in a number of different sorts of outreaches. I've only done one thing with Michael Shermer years and years ago. He and I were on a panel discussion on television with several other people, and we had some brief interaction on that panel, but it wasn't a one-on-one exchange.
Let's go to the first clip then. They're discussing Richard Dawkins and morality, and they get to the meat of it here. Here's the first clip.
But a second point on Dawkins' quote, because here I think we're making an error that I call Alvey's error, that is assessing the purpose of something at the wrong level of analysis. Alvey is Alvey Singer, Woody Allen's character in Annie Hall, where recall in the movie he has that flashback to childhood where he is no longer doing his homework and his mother takes him to the psychiatrist. And Alvey, why won't you do your homework? He says, because the universe is expanding. And he says, what? He says, well, the universe is expanding and someday it's going to all blow up. So it doesn't make any difference whether I do my homework or not. And his mother upbraids him and says, what's the universe got to do with it? We live in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn's not expanding. and I use this. This is one of my Scientific American columns, because I was responding to one of William Lane Craig's debates that I watched with him and Shelley Kagan about that, well, as he said here, on a naturalistic worldview, everything is ultimately destined to destruction and the heat death of the universe. As the universe expands, it grows colder and colder and heats up, and then nothing means anything. So Kagan responded to that. Oh, because Craig had brought up that godless Nazi torturers, they got away with it, so it didn't matter. And Kagan is Jewish, and he's like, this strikes me as an outrageous thing to suggest. It doesn't really matter. Surely it matters to the torture victims whether they're being tortured. It doesn't require that this makes some cosmic difference to the eternal significance of the universe for it to matter whether a human being is tortured. It matters to them, it matters to their family, and it matters to us. And then Craig committed a related fallacy when he argued that without God, there are no objective moral values, moral duties, or moral accountability. And if life ends at the grave, then ultimately it makes no difference whether you live as Stalin or as a Mother Teresa. So I call this Craig's categorical error, assessing the value of something by the wrong category of criteria. So, for example, we live in the here and now, not the hereafter, so our actions must be judged according to the criteria of this category, whether or not the category of a God-granted hereafter exists. Whether you behave like a Russian dictator who murdered tens of millions of people or a Roman Catholic missionary who tended the poor matters very much to the victims of totalitarianism and poverty. And then, so why does it matter? Well, because this is in our nature. We don't want to suffer.
I must say, I was really surprised at Michael Shermer's response to these 2 points, that without God, there is no ultimate meaning in life, and that without God, there is no ultimate value in life. Because all he did was simply point to subjective meanings and subjective values. It's important to me because I'm a victim of abuse, or it's important to the victims of the Holocaust that they suffered. But ultimately, which is my argument, it doesn't matter whether the Nazi torturers did this or not. Everything ends up the same. Nothing makes any ultimate difference. And similarly, the moral values he suggests are just subjective. For the Nazi torturers, it was good to rid the Aryan race of these Semitic influences. It was good to carry out the Holocaust. So it's just completely inadequate what Shermer says, that you can say that these things are subjectively valuable or meaningful to certain people. Nobody denies that. That would be a silly argument to say that. The argument is that these things in the absence of God are not objectively or ultimately meaningful or valuable.
Yeah. And Bill, I've been trying to think through what it means to commit a category mistake or a category error. He accuses you of Craig's categorical error. Take that apart for us a little bit.
Well, our listeners, I think, need to understand that these are just made up fallacies of Michael Shermer. That's all. There is no fallacy here. My argument is that in the absence of God, everything is doomed to ultimate destruction and non-existence, and therefore it does not make any ultimate difference what you do or think or say. It doesn't ultimately matter whether that little boy does his homework, even if it matters to his mother. It doesn't ultimately matter whether it matters to his mother. Ultimately, it all comes out the same. And so that's the argument. And there's no category mistake here whatsoever. If there's any mistake, it's his mistake in thinking that the affirmation of subjective meanings and subjective values is somehow sufficient to give life ultimate meaning and ultimate value.
Let's go to this next clip then. And I believe Stephen Meyer has some response in this one. Here's the next clip.
Yes.
Well, it matters to the individual person, but the idea of morality, as you point out, is that it is universal and it must be transpersonal. And one of the problems with tyrants is that there was no principle that they acknowledged that applied not only to themselves but to the people they tortured. So I know this is a deep question in moral philosophy, but I think that the underlying all ethical propositions are beliefs about values, and I think if you want an objective system of morality that transcends our individual opinions about what is valuable, there must be a valuer who has a claim on his opinion counting more. And I think if there is a creator who made us all with certain design parameters, then if there's a moral law that is offered to advance human flourishing, then I think the theistic account enables us to have that objective morality and have it grounded. But there's a ton more to say about this. We won't settle this one, but it's not an argument I make in the book.
Okay, good for Steve. He really nailed it. And what morality requires is a categorical demand upon all persons, normative demands. And similarly, with regard to ultimate significance and meaning, it can't just be individual and personal if it's to be objective. Shermer's view, one might think, lands us in sociocultural relativism. that every society has its own values and no society can judge another. You can't judge apartheid South Africa for its values because those are the ones that seem right to them. You can't judge uh, the Soviet Union for its values because it was right for them. You can't judge Nazi Germany for its values because they seemed right to the Nazis. But in fact, Shermer's view is even worse than sociocultural relativism because for him, it is individual, personal relativism. Every individual picks his own values and his own meanings for life. So it is complete relativism of the worst kind, and does not provide a basis for objective meaning or for moral value, as Steve Meyer so rightly explained.
One more clip, Bill. I believe they get back to Dawkins a little bit on this clip. Here's the next clip.
But one final point on that, that Dawkins himself is not a moral relativist. As you know, he has no qualms about criticizing Islam and say female genital mutilation as being objectively wrong. This is horrible. And he rants about this. So clearly, even he, with that famous quote.
That implies that female persons are valuable. And that begs a question. The Grand says who? Are they valuable only to the female persons who are being mutilated or only to Richard Dawkins? Or are there objective principles above us all to which we can appeal that reflect a valuation that is not derivative of our subjective opinions?
Yeah, well, I say the
and
latter.
I think theism says, yes, there is, and I can tell you where that comes from. And I think that, the Harvard law professor Harold Berman said, underneath all ethical systems is an unspoken question, which he said the Grand says who question. And if the Grand says who is always answered by, well, me or you, I, thou, then we're going to get a lot of different moralities coming out of that. And I think for those of us who accept moral objectivism, I think that's a problem. And I think theism solves that problem. I don't think an evolutionary account of morality does. I think we end up realizing that once we understand that the moral principles or our sense of what's valuable has been programmed into us for survival only, if my survival interests depart from the group, I have no compelling reason to continue to go with the dominant morality of the group.
Here, Meyer exposes so beautifully the contradiction in Shermer's own views and in Richard Dawkins' view. Dawkins wants to affirm moral nihilism, but then he finds himself making all sorts of moral judgments about others. Shermer wants to affirm personal relativism, but then he also wants to make all of these personal moral judgments about others. And there's no basis for doing that once you have either nihilism or personal relativism, because every person's view is right for him. And so Shermer is caught in a deep, deep contradiction here of sensing the objective demands of morality upon his life, and yet having no basis for it other than this personal relativism.
Yeah, he says underneath all moral systems says who? That's this unspoken question. Says who?
Yeah.
Wow. And theism solves the problem.
And Shermer's answer is, I do. I say, and that's all he's got. But of course, the Nazi says, I do, and so does the Soviet communists. They all say, I do. I'm the one who says.
Bill, this was a long exchange. I think it went something like an hour and a half, but you come up again a couple of times in this. And so in some future podcasts, we may look at some more clips. And
okay.
In fact, there's some
it's really interesting to see Steve Meyer discussing moral philosophy, but he did a great job.